There are moments in history when everything feels unsettled, when confusion becomes so common that people stop questioning it, and truth itself begins to feel like something unwelcome. That is exactly where we are now. What you are witnessing in both society and the church is not random disorder or a sudden collapse, but the result of a long process, an intellectual and spiritual decline that has been quietly unfolding for decades. And yet, even in the middle of this uncertainty, there are subtle signs that something deeper is shifting beneath the surface, something that cannot be seen immediately but is slowly taking shape. When you step back and look carefully at the current state of culture in the church, a clear pattern begins to emerge. It resembles what many thinkers have described as the final stage of modernism. In earlier times, scholars carefully outlined how this movement would develop in phases, showing how a theological error begins as an idea, then gradually spreads until it becomes deeply rooted within institutions. At the beginning, these ideas were examined in academic settings, where their philosophical foundations were challenged and often dismantled by serious Catholic thinkers. But over time, those intellectual defenses were ignored by those in positions of influence, allowing the ideas to continue spreading even after their weaknesses had already been exposed. What followed was not an immediate collapse, but a slow transition into what can be called a superficial phase. In this stage, the deeper intellectual debates had already been exhausted, but the effects of those ideas remained embedded in both culture and church life. People began repeating concepts they no longer fully understood. This created a kind of intellectual shallowness where even obvious truths started to be questioned and basic doctrine was no longer widely accepted as it once was. Statements that had long been considered foundational suddenly became open to reinterpretation, not because they had changed, but because clarity itself had begun to fade. This confusion did not stay limited to theology. It gradually spread into the way people think about everything. The standard of truth began to shift away from objective reality and toward personal feeling and subjective experience. Once truth is no longer anchored outside the individual, emotion starts to take the place of reason. What feels right becomes more important than what is actually true. And this shift has had a deep impact on both culture and the church. Disagreement is no longer seen as part of honest discussion, but often treated as a personal offense. Objective moral claims are replaced with individual interpretation, and the idea of shared truth begins to weaken. As this mindset took hold, society slowly lost its ability to sustain meaningful moral conversation. In both religious and secular spaces, there is now a growing pressure to avoid anything that might create discomfort or challenge popular opinion. This leads to a situation where clarity is sacrificed in order to maintain acceptance. Truth is softened, adjusted, or left unspoken to avoid conflict. Over time, this creates a culture where serious moral and spiritual issues are no longer addressed directly because they are considered too controversial to discuss openly. Within the church, similar patterns can be observed. Over the years, many decisions and teachings have lacked depth, often shaped more by reaction to cultural trends than by strong theological reasoning. This has led to a growing disconnect between what is officially taught and what is actually lived. Many faithful Catholics recognize this gap. They notice that public statements do not always reflect the consistency that once defined Catholic life. There is a sense that something has shifted, even if it is not always clearly explained. Now, however, another phase seems to be emerging. This stage is more forceful, even restrictive, where persuasion is no longer the primary method. Instead, authority begins to rely more on pressure and enforcement. When ideas lose their intellectual strength but remain in positions of influence, they often attempt to maintain control through institutional power rather than genuine conviction. This shift is becoming more visible both in society and within parts of the church. Disagreement is not always addressed through discussion, but sometimes dismissed or silenced altogether. This creates what many describe as an elephant in the room. There are major moral, doctrinal, and cultural issues that people clearly recognize, yet they are rarely addressed openly by those in leadership. There is a growing sense that certain truths are acknowledged privately but avoided publicly. This leads to a disconnect between what people experience and what they are told to believe. The result is a feeling of instability, where many sense that something is wrong but struggle to find clear acknowledgement from those in authority. At the same time, measurable signs of decline in religious practice have become difficult to ignore. Participation in sacramental life has decreased in many places. Moral consistency among believers has weakened, and engagement with church teaching has declined across various regions. Despite this, official messaging often focuses on optimism and renewal, creating a contrast between statistical reality and institutional narrative. This gap deepens the sense of confusion among the faithful, who can see the difference between what is being said and what is actually happening. Alongside this, there is increasing pressure on those who speak openly about moral and doctrinal concerns. Both clergy and laity who try to express traditional Catholic teaching sometimes find themselves criticized or pushed aside, not necessarily because they are wrong, but because they raise uncomfortable questions. This creates a climate where caution replaces courage and silence begins to feel safer than clarity. And yet, even in the middle of this difficult situation, there are early signs of renewal. Among younger generations, both within the clergy and among the laity, there is a growing interest in authentic doctrine, traditional forms of worship, and a more serious approach to moral life. This suggests that beneath the surface of institutional instability, something quieter is beginning to take root. It may not be visible yet on a large scale, but it is there, forming slowly in places that are often overlooked. There are times when this silence can feel overwhelming, as if nothing is happening at all, as if even heaven itself has gone quiet. But those moments are not empty. In many cases, they are the final stage before a decisive shift. What appears to be stillness is often a period of preparation, where everything is being arranged beneath the surface before it becomes visible. In the context of spiritual struggle, delay does not mean absence. It often means preparation. What looks like inactivity can actually be the final tightening of circumstances before resolution arrives. During this phase, it may seem as though opposing forces are in control, but in reality, their limits are already set. They cannot go beyond a certain point. This pattern is not only visible in individual situations, but also in the broader spiritual condition of the church and the world. There are long periods where confusion dominates, where truth feels quiet and error becomes loud. Yet even in those moments, something deeper is unfolding, something that is not immediately visible, but is moving steadily toward its own conclusion. What often goes unnoticed in these moments is that periods of visible decline frequently happen at the same time as hidden consolidation. While disorder seems to increase on the surface, something deeper is being tested, refined, and in some cases even strengthened underneath. This is why it is important not to interpret every crisis as a final defeat. In spiritual terms, not everything that appears to be loss is truly loss. Some of it is pruning, and pruning always looks destructive before it begins to produce growth. When you take a broader view, it becomes clear that this struggle is not random. It follows a pattern that has appeared again and again throughout history. Periods marked by confusion are often followed by correction, and times of suppression are eventually followed by renewed clarity. The key point is that this process is not uncontrolled. Even when human systems fail or become distorted, there remains a boundary they cannot cross. That boundary is not determined by human authority, but by a higher order that ultimately governs everything. This is also why discouragement can be spiritually dangerous. When people begin to believe that confusion or corruption is permanent, they lose sight of how history actually works. It does not remain fixed in one condition. Change is always part of the process, both for restoration and for correction. At the same time, it is important to understand that not all resistance comes from outside. Some of the most difficult struggles take place within individuals and communities trying to remain faithful in an environment that feels unstable or unclear. That internal tension can become exhausting. When clarity is replaced by constant ambiguity, people begin to feel worn down. Over time, they may start to question not only what is happening around them, but whether clarity itself is even possible anymore. And this is where strong spiritual grounding becomes essential. Without it, the surrounding confusion begins to shape perception more than truth itself. Even in these conditions, There are always individuals who continue to seek truth with sincerity. They may not be many, and they may not hold visible positions of influence, but their role is significant. They preserve continuity with what is real and stable, and that continuity matters far more than appearances. Institutions can look strong while weakening internally, and they can appear weakened while quietly preserving something essential that will later become important again. What is visible is not always a reliable measure of what is real. This is why discernment becomes so important. Not everything that is loud is correct, and not everything that is quiet is absent. In times of confusion, the ability to distinguish between surface noise and deeper reality becomes one of the most valuable skills a person can develop. Without that ability, it becomes easy to mistake appearance for truth. It is also important to recognize that opposition often intensifies when correction is near. Systems or ideas that have already lost their internal coherence tend to resist change more aggressively when their instability begins to be exposed. This resistance can take many forms. It may appear as pressure, dismissal, or even attempts to silence discussion. But historically, such reactions often indicate that the underlying structure is no longer as secure as it once seemed. After this phase, resolution rarely comes immediately. Instead, there is usually a transitional period where opposing forces become more visible and contradictions that were once hidden begin to surface openly. This stage can feel uncomfortable because it removes the illusion of stability, but at the same time, it creates the conditions necessary for real clarity to return. Without exposure, there can be no correction. From a spiritual perspective, exposure is not destruction, it is revelation. What is revealed may be difficult to face, but it is necessary if anything is to be rebuilt on a foundation that is actually true. At the same time, it is important not to reduce everything to conflict. Even during periods of tension, signs of renewal begin to appear quietly, often in places that are overlooked or underestimated. These signs are not dramatic, but they are meaningful. They can be seen in a renewed interest in spiritual depth, in the return of seriousness among younger generations, and in a growing dissatisfaction with shallow explanations that no longer answer deeper questions. These developments may not dominate the landscape yet, but they reveal a clear direction. They show that even in confusion, there remains a pull toward truth, order, and coherence. Because of this, the present moment cannot be understood only as decline. It must also be seen as a period of formation. What is being shaped now will become more visible later, once the surrounding noise begins to settle. And even within uncertainty, there is still an underlying structure to what is happening. It is not random, and it is not without direction. It is a process that continues to move forward, even when it is not immediately visible. As this process unfolds, one of the most important things to understand is that cultural and spiritual decline does not move in a straight line. It tends to accelerate at certain times, then slow down, and then shift direction in ways that are difficult to predict in the moment. What appears chaotic on the surface often follows a deeper logic that only becomes clear in hindsight. This is especially true during times when confusion becomes widespread. In those moments, many people begin to assume that clarity has been permanently lost. But in reality, clarity has not disappeared. It has simply become harder to access because of the overwhelming number of competing voices. Truth is still present, but it is buried under layers of noise. One of the consequences of this environment is that people begin to rely more on personal interpretation rather than objective grounding. When this happens, shared understanding begins to break down. Communication becomes fragmented, and ideas that were once widely accepted start to be questioned even among those who once agreed. This shift does not happen by accident. It reflects a deeper change in how truth itself is perceived. When external points of reference weaken, internal perception becomes dominant. And when internal perception takes over without proper formation, instability follows naturally. In this kind of environment, even the most basic concepts can become controversial. Not because the concepts have changed, but because the framework used to understand them has shifted. As a result, confusion begins to appear intellectual. but it is often rooted in something deeper, an instability in how people process and interpret reality. This is why periods of cultural and spiritual instability are often accompanied by a breakdown in shared reasoning. Discussions become less about truth and more about perspective, and perspective itself becomes disconnected from any stable foundation. At the same time, institutions that are meant to preserve continuity often struggle to respond effectively to these changes. Instead of reinforcing clarity, they sometimes reflect the same instability found in the surrounding culture. This only deepens the confusion rather than resolving it. This creates a situation where authority and clarity no longer move together. Authority may still exist in structure, but clarity does not always accompany it. And this disconnect generates tension that becomes more visible over time. As a result, many individuals begin to withdraw inwardly, focusing more on personal interpretation than shared understanding. While this inward focus can provide a sense of stability, it also weakens the ability to engage with truth on a collective level. What emerges is a fragmented environment where agreement becomes rare and disagreement becomes normal. Even sincere attempts to clarify truth are often misunderstood or dismissed, not because they lack substance, but because the shared framework needed to evaluate them has weakened. Even in the middle of this fragmentation, it is important to understand that it does not represent the final stage. History shows that periods of division are often followed by moments of consolidation, where scattered ideas and groups begin to reorganize around clearer and more stable principles. This reorganization does not happen suddenly. It usually begins quietly through individuals or small communities who continue to hold a consistent understanding even when broader agreement has broken down. Over time, these steady points begin to serve as reference anchors for wider renewal, even if their importance is not immediately recognized. Another factor that becomes increasingly significant during extended periods of confusion is fatigue. When uncertainty continues without resolution, people naturally grow tired. This exhaustion can lead in two different directions. Some individuals begin to withdraw, accepting confusion as something permanent and no longer worth resisting. Others, however, respond differently. They become more determined to search for clarity, even when it is difficult to find. Those who choose this second path often play an important role later because their persistence preserves a sense of continuity during a time when larger systems remain unsettled. At the same time, it is necessary to acknowledge that not all confusion comes from outside influences. Some of it develops within institutions themselves, especially when long-standing frameworks are no longer sufficient to address new realities. When this happens, tension begins to build between inherited structures and present conditions. This tension is uncomfortable because it forces deeper questions to surface, questions that may have been avoided for a long time. But avoiding those questions only extends the instability. Eventually, underlying contradictions have to be confronted if any meaningful resolution is going to take place. In this sense, difficult periods are also moments of revelation. They expose weaknesses that were previously hidden and force a clearer distinction between what is truly stable and what only appeared stable under easier circumstances. This exposure can feel disruptive, but it is necessary for real correction. Without it, systems tend to drift further away from coherence while still maintaining the appearance of continuity. What makes the current situation particularly complex is that this process of exposure is happening across multiple levels at the same time: cultural, institutional, and personal. This creates a widespread sense of instability, but it also means that when correction begins, it will likely take place across all of these levels as well. Even so, not every disruption should be interpreted as collapse. Some disruptions are transitional. They signal movement rather than an ending. The challenge is learning how to distinguish between the two. That distinction requires patience, because immediate appearances can be misleading. What looks like decay may actually be part of a transition, and what appears stable may in fact be stagnant. Only with time does the difference become clear. In the meantime, individuals are placed in a situation where they must navigate uncertainty without losing their sense of direction. This requires a level of inner stability that does not depend entirely on external consistency. Those who develop this internal grounding are better able to remain steady even when everything around them feels uncertain. They are less likely to be shaken by sudden changes because their orientation is not tied only to shifting external conditions. And so, even in a fragmented environment, a path forward continues to exist. It may not always be obvious, and it may not be easy to follow, but it remains present beneath the surface, waiting for the right conditions to become clearer. As this situation continues to unfold, another layer becomes increasingly important to recognize. When confusion persists over long periods, it does not remain neutral. It begins to shape how people think, how they behave, and even what they consider normal. What once seemed unusual gradually becomes familiar. This is one of the most subtle effects of prolonged instability. People do not necessarily change because they are convinced by new ideas, but because they become tired of resisting them. And when that fatigue sets in, standards begin to shift quietly, often without anyone consciously deciding to change them. This gradual shift can be more powerful than direct argument. In an environment where shared assumptions have weakened, logical reasoning loses much of its influence. Instead, repetition and constant exposure begin to shape perception more than careful thought. Over time, this creates a gap between appearance and reality. Institutions and systems may seem unchanged on the surface, but internally they begin to adapt to external pressures in ways that are not immediately visible. This is where the difference between structural continuity and functional continuity becomes important. Something can continue to exist in its original form while its internal coherence slowly weakens or moves in a different direction. When this happens across multiple areas at once, the overall sense of stability becomes misleading. Things may look the same outwardly, but they are no longer operating under the same assumptions. This disconnect contributes to a growing sense of uncertainty among those who are paying attention. People begin to notice that explanations no longer fully align with outcomes, and that official narratives do not always account for what can be observed in reality. In response, individuals tend to react in different ways. Some disengage completely, choosing not to analyze what feels too complex or unresolved. Others become more critical, trying to identify inconsistencies and underlying causes. Both responses are understandable, but neither fully resolves the tension. What becomes clear is that clarity can no longer be assumed. It has to be actively pursued and carefully maintained. Without intentional effort, the natural direction is toward further fragmentation. At the same time, it is important to recognize that fragmentation does not completely remove structure. Even in disordered environments, certain underlying principles continue to operate, even if they are not immediately visible. These principles still influence outcomes over time, especially in moral and spiritual matters, where consequences often unfold gradually rather than instantly. What is tolerated repeatedly eventually shapes the conditions in which future decisions are made. Because of this, periods of delay should not be mistaken for a lack of consequence. In many cases, consequences are simply developing at a pace that does not match immediate expectations. This difference between expectation and reality often leads to frustration. People look for quick resolution, but instead encounter processes that require endurance. And endurance becomes one of the defining qualities needed to navigate long periods of uncertainty. Those who remain steady without becoming reactive tend to preserve a clearer sense of direction, even when external circumstances continue to shift. At the same time, external pressures add layers of complexity. Social, cultural, and institutional systems interact with each other in ways that are not always predictable. This makes it difficult to identify a single cause for broader trends. Instead, multiple influences overlap, sometimes reinforcing each other and sometimes counteracting each other depending on the situation. As this complexity increases, communication itself begins to change. Ideas are shortened, nuance is lost, and deeper explanations are often replaced with simplified narratives or slogans. While this makes communication faster, it reduces precision, and over time, this loss of precision contributes to misunderstanding and division. And yet, even within this environment where clarity is often reduced and confusion seems to dominate, there are still places where stability continues to exist. These areas are not always the most visible or the most influential, but they remain consistent. They hold on to more grounded ways of thinking and interpreting reality, preserving a continuity that does not depend on shifting trends. Their influence may not be immediate, but it is steady. Over time, they function as quiet points of balance within an otherwise unstable landscape. This reality shows that even during periods of disorder, structure is not completely lost. Instead, it survives in smaller, less noticeable forms, pockets of coherence that resist being fully absorbed into the surrounding confusion. The difficulty is that these pockets are often overlooked or underestimated precisely because they do not align with dominant narratives. As a result, their true importance is usually recognized only later, when broader conditions begin to shift. In the meantime, most people continue navigating a mixed environment where clarity and confusion exist side by side. This coexistence creates tension, but it also forces a kind of discernment, even if indirectly. People are compelled to evaluate what they see and hear more carefully, whether they realize it or not. And so the process continues, not as a single collapse or a single resolution, but as an ongoing interaction between stability and instability, between order and fragmentation, each shaping the other over time. As this unfolding reality moves forward, it becomes increasingly clear that the tension between disorder and structure does not resolve quickly or through one decisive moment. Instead, it progresses through stages, often quietly, until the shift becomes undeniable only after it has already begun. One of the most important aspects of this stage is recognizing that what appears to be decline on one level can simultaneously be preparation on another. This is not easy to see in real time, because human attention naturally focuses on what is most visible. When disorder dominates the surface, it becomes difficult to recognize what is developing beneath it. Yet that hidden development continues regardless of whether it is immediately noticed, and when it eventually surfaces, it often appears sudden, even though it has been forming for a long time. Even then, visibility alone does not resolve everything. Once something becomes visible, it still requires interpretation, judgment, and response. This is where discernment becomes essential. Not every reaction to exposure leads toward clarity. Some responses oversimplify what is actually complex, creating new forms of confusion rather than resolving the existing ones. In such a situation, the ability to remain steady without rushing to conclusions becomes a form of stability in itself. It allows reality to reveal itself more fully before decisions are made. Alongside this, another quiet development is taking place in the background, the gradual return of seriousness. In different places, there is a renewed interest in depth, meaning, and ways of thinking that are not purely reactive. This shift is not dominant yet, but it is consistent. It can be seen among those who are no longer satisfied with surface level explanations and who are willing to engage more deeply with fundamental questions. This matters because it shows that the desire for truth and coherence has not disappeared. Even after long periods of confusion, the human inclination toward order remains. It may become quieter and more selective, but it does not vanish. Instead, it begins to reemerge in more deliberate ways, often outside the most visible spaces. At the same time, the broader environment continues to change, sometimes in ways that are difficult to predict. Certain developments accelerate while others slow down. Some tensions increase while others begin to ease. The overall picture is not one of stillness, but of movement. And within that movement, the challenge is not simply to interpret events, but to maintain a sense of direction while moving through them. Without that sense of orientation, even accurate information becomes difficult to place within a meaningful framework. And so the final insight is not that everything suddenly becomes clear, but that clarity remains possible even within complexity. It may require patience, careful attention, and discernment, but it is not lost. What emerges, then, is not an ending, but a transition, a movement from hidden instability toward visible reality, from assumed coherence toward tested coherence, and from confusion toward a clarity that must be rebuilt rather than simply accepted.